So I would now like to welcome Professor Lane to speak to us on the fascinating subject of From Machiavelli to Nietzsche, How Modern Thinkers Saw Ancient Lawgivers. Thank you, Miss.
Thank you for being here this evening, both in the room and online. Can freedom ever be brought about by force, or is persuasion a better path to social transformation? How can new political orders be instituted and maintained? And is the answer different depending on whether they seek one-person domination or civic liberty? And on the spectrum of persuasion and force, where should we place the institution of new religions, which have transformed societies from ancient Israel, India, and Iran to the founding of Christianity and the Reformation and beyond? These questions have preoccupied philosophers for centuries. They present paradoxes that cannot be easily resolved, and they raise ethical and political challenges that are difficult to confront. And for the three great political philosophers who are my subjects tonight, the questions were encapsulated in the figures of ancient lawgivers as potential models for future political and cultural change. So tonight's three thinkers are Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in Italian in the early 16th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing in French in the mid-18th century, and Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in German in the late 19th century. All three of them grappled with what I called in the first lecture of this series. My lectures this year have all been on the topic of lawgivers in political imaginations, and I referred to the Janus-faced figure of the lawgiver. Janus is a Roman god who faces in both directions. And in this case, the lawgivers face both to reshape society profoundly and then to stabilize it in its new form. So all three of tonight's thinkers, whom we just met, sought to expand the tools for lawgiving that I've talked about in earlier lectures. So I've talked about written laws and about unwritten customs, and tonight we'll see an expanded toolkit, including the role of religion and the place of violent force. And all three of tonight's thinkers elevated Moses, who I discussed in my last lecture, to the ranks of one of the greatest lawgivers of antiquity. In fact, they read Moses in very different ways. So Machiavelli read him as an armed prophet who established a new polity by using violence. Rousseau read him as a model of legislative transformation through persuasion alone, while Nietzsche's complex rhetoric combined appeals to spiritual force with at least images of physical violence. So each of these readings confronts us with a paradox that cannot be easily resolved. And so these are the three themes of tonight's lecture. I'll start, in fact, in the middle row with Rousseau on what I call the paradox of legislative persuasion. Then I'll move backward to Machiavelli on the paradox of force and freedom. And then we'll conclude with Nietzsche on the paradox of persuasive force. Is that spiritual, material, or somehow both? So let me start by introducing Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was born in 1712 in Calvinist Geneva, but had converted to Catholicism and moved to France, aligning himself there with the great intellectual and political project of the Enlightenment philosophers, the philosophes. But at the age of 37, Rousseau had a road to Damascus moment. He was actually on the road to the city of Vincennes, in which he came to see the commerce and civilization of France and other enlightened countries as morally corrupt and unjust. He contrasted them in that moment of insight with the strict patriotic virtues that had animated the Genevan Republic at its best, and even more so, the ancient republics of the Spartans, the Romans, and the Israelites. And in Rousseau's eyes, each of those ancient republics owed its political legitimacy, its moral virtue, and its longevity to an individual lawgiver. And he would come to elevate the Spartan Lycurgus and the Roman Numa alongside the Jewish Moses as the three principal lawgivers among the ancients who deserve particular attention. And in fact, he claimed that at least on the grounds of longevity, Moses was the greatest of them because of how long his laws had lasted. So as Rousseau wrote, the laws of Solon, of Numa, of Lycurgus are dead. Those of Moses, far more ancient, are still alive. Now, it was with those models in mind that Rousseau's political thinking centered on this quest. How does one make politics legitimate in the way that these ancient republics had been? Indeed, how, if at all, could modern polities be made legitimate? Would that be possible anywhere in Europe? And we'll see at the end of my discussion of Rousseau one of his answers. He held out no hope that this could be done in France, where he would die in 1778, just about a decade before the outbreak of the French Revolution. Now, Rousseau argued that the consent of the people was what was necessary, always and everywhere, to make laws legitimate. And he called that the general will. But he held that no people, ancient or modern, could be expected to accomplish that task of formulating a general will all on their own. Instead, they would always need a legislator, someone like those ancient lawgivers whom we've just met, whose task would be to frame the laws, to give them their content, and then to help to get people to adopt them. Now, when I say legislator or lawgiver, those are both translations of the same French word, législateur. But for clarity, I'm saying lawgiver when I'm referring to the ancient figures, and legislator when I'm referring to Rousseau's own theoretical formulation. So how could a lawgiver get their laws adopted by the general will to create a new legitimate political order? Well, one answer that Rousseau gave was not by force. He insisted that the legislator must not use force, and indeed he said that a legislator was not a ruler. Their role, as he wrote, was not magistracy, not sovereignty. It has nothing in common with human dominion. So, if not force, then what? So this is perhaps one of the most famous passages in the social contract, which we'll continue on the next slide, and it introduces us to the paradox, what I've called the paradox of legislative persuasion. Because the challenge is, as you see in the lines in green, Gresham green or turquoise, that men would have to be prior to laws what they ought to become by means of laws. So this is the paradox. Somehow the lawgiver has to form people such that they're willing to accept the general will, and yet they have to be willing to accept the general will in order to make the laws legitimate. And you can see other expressions of the paradox here. The effect would have to become the cause. So how can that happen? He gives us the answer as the passage continues. The legislator is unable to use either force or reasoning. So they can't simply use logic and reason, rational argument. they can't use force, they have to use something that's different from both violence and reason, somehow falling between those two poles. And in Rousseau's phrase here, this famous phrase, the legislator must persuade without convincing. So convincing there refers to a form of rational argument, but the legislator's task instead is to persuade. Now, what does this mean? Well, we can see a clue in the recurrence of that very phrase in a later work called The Essay on the Origin of Languages, where Rousseau remarked that the earliest human languages, as they evolved, were able to persuade without convincing, and they did that through engaging the passions, the senses, and the emotions, through using pictures and images, and even musicality in order to persuade. So that tells us that what the lawgivers must do is persuade by appealing to the passions. It's not enough to speak to reason. You have to involve the whole person in the general will. And we can find a further clue as to how this happened by considering how Rousseau explained the success of those ancient lawgivers. Because again, remember, he thought that Moses, Lycurgus, and Numa had in fact succeeded in these tasks. So how did they do this? Well, what we'll see is that Rousseau commented that in each case, they effected persuasion by instituting new ceremonies, new rites, new games, both civic and religious. So this is an image of the training ground in ancient Sparta, for example, where the Spartan youth would exercise. And this is where, and training grounds like this could be created a new way of life, which could persuade without convincing by becoming incorporated in citizens' identities, in their habits, their customs, their ways of life. Now, in fact, in my lecture in February, I pointed out that this approach was especially in the minds of many scholars associated with Sparta and with Lycurgus in instituting unwritten customs that could have this effect. And Rousseau emphasized that point as well. So he wrote of Lycurgus, the Spartan lawgiver, that Lycurgus wanted to write only in the hearts of the Spartans. And how did he do that? Through, as you see in the Gresham green at the bottom of the slide, through their laws, their games, their loves, their festivities. Through all of that, Lycurgus was able to cultivate an ardent love of the fatherland in the hearts of the Spartans, which yielded a general will. Now, he thought that Numa and Moses also did the same, but they went further, because both of them also instituted a civil religion, which could also even more profoundly have this transformative, paradoxical effect. And in both cases, as we'll see, the new religion was not a matter of mere beliefs, but again, it involved rites, ceremonies, festivities, which could have a similar effect to what transpired on that ancient Spartan training ground, perhaps even more profound. So in the case of the Roman Numa, for example, so we see here the foundations of civil religion in all of these three societies, but especially in Rome and Israel. And in the case of Numa, Rousseau thought that although he was only the third king of ancient Rome, he was the true founder because he was the one who established the rites of their religion and therefore acted in transforming them into citizens. Now you can see that there's a slightly derogatory reference there to their apparently frivolous and superstitious rites. And this is, of course, a value judgment from Rousseau's, or perhaps his expected readers' modern Christian perspective. But in fact, while that sounds negative about Numa, Rousseau saw the ancient pagan religions overall as having been much better suited to fostering the civic virtues than Christianity had generally proven to be. So Christianity taught people to care more about their immortal souls than their mortal cities. But the ancient Roman religion had fostered rituals and ceremonies that bonded people to one another and thus enabled them to form a general will. Now, the key here, though, as we turn to Moses, is that ancient Israel, in Rousseau's view, belonged alongside ancient paganism in that latter row, the bottom row of this slide. In other words, ancient Israel, like ancient paganism, had this effect of forming a civil religion. So what we say about Moses, Rousseau says about Moses, a very similar thing to what we saw him say about ancient Roman religion, that he gave the Jewish people morals and practices incompatible with those of other nations. He overburdened it, this is the people, with distinctive rites and ceremonies. And by doing that, he also formed the Israelites into a distinctive people. So the bonds of fraternity form Israel and keep it from blending with its neighbors. And these institutions form distinctive practices which are able to keep the citizens assembled. So here we see this is a summary of all three lawgivers in their work in forging these common bonds that could create the general will. So all of this had to take place through persuasion. But when we call it persuasion, it's not mere speeches or words or rhetoric. It's rather inculcated more subliminally through the customs and habits and practices that collectively come about to constitute a new identity. So the paradox of persuasion for Rousseau is that the lawgiver cannot rightfully use force or violence, yet they can transform the identity of the citizens even more profoundly than any violent rupture could ever do. To conclude our discussion of Rousseau, then, we may ask, did he see any of this as a possible model for his own time? So he asserted this in a letter about Geneva. He wrote, I presented the festivals of Sparta, that's another term for Sparta, as a model for those that I should like to see among us, that is, Genevan citizens. At this point, his citizenship had been restored. And he wrote, let us consider what can be done on the basis of what has been done. So the ancient lawgivers give us a clue to what might be possible in one's own day. But that did not mean that those ancient models could be adopted anywhere and everywhere. Only communities whose customs had not been too permanently corrupted could potentially succeed. Perhaps Geneva could be appropriately reformed. Perhaps he thought Poland, which at the time was a less developed country than other parts of Europe. And finally, perhaps Corsica, which was an island that had been recently freed from French domination and for which Rousseau would in fact sketch out a plan of legislation. So he wrote, in Europe, there is still one country capable of legislation. It is the island of Corsica. And he ends this remark, I have a feeling that someday this little island will astound Europe, because perhaps it will be the place where a legitimate general will in the modern world could be established. Now that paradox of Corsica potentially astounding Europe is one that Rousseau's admired and much studied precursor, Niccolò Machiavelli, would also have relished. And so now I want to sum up Rousseau and turn to Machiavelli, turn backwards several centuries to the 16th century. So we've just seen that Rousseau saw the figure of the legislator as having to deploy persuasion alone in order to allow the people to be free. The people could only be free if they expressed the general will and themselves enacted the laws, and so formed a free republic. So here a republic is a law-governed society of patriotically minded political equals who are free as opposed to being dominated by a tyrant, or even, for the most stringent republicans, ruled by a king or queen. Now, this brings me then to Machiavelli, who would also reflect on the possibilities of republics, but would argue that sometimes force, violent force, would be necessary to found them. And this brings us to Machiavelli on the paradox of force and freedom, violence perhaps being necessary to found a republic or to save it. Now, Machiavelli anticipated and shared Rousseau's celebration of republics as uniquely free polities. And so he shared that admiration for Moses, Lycurgus, and Numa. Isaiah Berlin would say that of Machiavelli that his heroes were Moses, Numa, Lycurgus, exactly the same list. And just as Rousseau would grow up in Republican Geneva, Machiavelli spent a key part of his life in Republican Florence. And he served in the Republic of Florence for several decades, in between periods of domination by the Medici family. And you can see in the bottom row that after he had been serving the Republic led by Piero Soderini, when the Medici returned to power, Machiavelli was dismissed, tortured, and exiled. He was dismissed from his role as a secretary of the Republic. And so the Medici came to rule as what Machiavelli called princes. They dominated Florence for the sake of their own power and reputation, rather than ruling for the sake of the common good and freedom, as the Republic had done. Now, it's in that context that Machiavelli explored this paradox. And actually, there are two different aspects to the paradox, which we can see as we look at his two major works. So one is the question of how to understand his book, The Prince, which circulated in manuscript in 1513, so just a year after the Medici came back into power. And he dedicated The Prince to a member of the Medici family, which is a paradox in itself, given his own previous service to the Republic. Now, in a later work, Discourses on Livy's History of Rome, we see that he discussed republics alongside principalities, and it's clear there that he celebrated republics as the path to political freedom. But then we have to confront the problem that the freedom of a republic might sometimes have to be established or saved through violence. So let's see how that worked, and we'll begin with The Prince. So there we find Machiavelli interested in lawgivers who founded a city and its new orders through what he called their virtù. And virtù is the Italian word that Machiavelli used to span the gamut between the Latin virtus, which had been used by Cicero and others and meant all the traditional moral virtues, and what scholars have called the more modern idea of virtuosity or skill. So we have to hear also in virtù a sense of masculine. It is masculine virility. The word vir in Latin is the word for man, and this refers to the audacity in which a man could force the day, as it were, to bring about a new civic constitution. So Machiavelli highlights a slightly different cast list. Although he admired Lycurgus and Numa, I'm going to focus on what he says about these men who are, as he calls them, men who became princes by their own virtue or virtù. And he says these are Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. And if we go on, we can see that three of them were men who acquired or founded kingdoms. So Cyrus the Great of Persia, Romulus, who became the first king of Rome, having murdered his twin brother in order to ascend the throne alone, and Theseus of Athens, who became a king long before Athens became a republic or democracy. Moses, on the other hand, founded a republic, and we'll return to that. Now, all of these men had to use their exceptional virtue to exploit opportunities that were provided by fortune in order to introduce new orders. And this is extremely difficult. It's difficult to found new orders because everyone, Machiavelli says, who benefited from the old orders will be an enemy to the new. But the potential partisans of the new orders have not yet emerged. So this is another version of that paradox of founding. We need to already appeal to the adherents of the new order before it's ever been introduced. So this is why it's difficult to found new orders, as I've just explained. And if we continue, we can see, this is the lukewarmness of the adversaries, and continuing, we can see that this then, in Machiavelli's view, required force. So here's the crucial sentence for the paradox of force and freedom. Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus would not have been able to make their peoples observe their constitutions for long if they had been unarmed. And notice that in each one of these pictures, there is, in fact, a weapon. Each one of these figures was deploying violence in order to come to power. Now, this is a contrast in the case of Moses. Remember, I said that for Rousseau, Moses would be someone who used persuasion alone. He introduced new ceremonies and religion. But for Machiavelli, Moses too had been an armed prophet. He was not unarmed. And indeed, he drew a comparison to Savonarola, who had held sway in Florence just a few years before the Medici returned. And he noted that Savonarola was ruined in his new orders because he had no mode for holding firm those who had believed, nor for making unbelievers believe. So that was the consequence of Savonarola being an unarmed prophet. Now, this was especially difficult then in the case of Moses, and that's in bold there because now we're going to look at Moses founding a republic through, in Machiavelli's eyes, the use of violence. Now, let me say a bit more about how one forms a republic and what a republic is in order to see how this works. So again, a republic has to enjoy collective freedom and wants to be free from unlawful violence. And so the purpose even of a violent founder is the common good. So there's a kind of paradox here. You might have a violent single founder, but their role is to establish the common good. And moreover, if we go on, Machiavelli argued that once a republic has been founded, for the most part, you can rely on the many, the people, to care for it. So you shouldn't always need to use violence to protect a republic. So in the second paragraph, he says, the many won't be able to found it because they don't all know what's good. That's what the lawgiver has to do. But once they've come to know it, they do not agree to abandon it. People become invested in a republic, and they want to protect it. And moreover, if we go on, Machiavelli emphasized that, again, religion could do a lot to help to protect a republic and therefore forestall the need for more violence. So he said this about Numa, again, how important religion was, and Machiavelli took a slightly cynical view, arguing that Numa had pretended to be intimate with a nymph, a divine figure who had revealed religion to him. And so here we see Numa being situated as a founder who's willing to make use of what Machiavelli calls fraud as well as force. Religion, in a way, for him is a fraud perpetrated on the people, but for a good cause, genuinely to cultivate the common good. So all of that could work, but there might be moments when a violent refoundation of a republic is needed. And this is an illustration from the later history of Sparta. So some centuries after Lycurgus in the 3rd century before the Common Era, 2 new kings of Sparta arose, and this is the first one, Agus, who thought that the people in the city had come to deviate from the laws of Lycurgus, and so the city had lost its ancient virtue. So August tries to now become a refounder, but he fails. He was killed in his first beginnings by the Spartan ephors, those are the main Spartan office holders, because they saw him as a man who wished to seize the tyranny. So this is the danger of trying to use violence to refound a republic, is that it may appear to people that in fact what you're doing is trying to become a tyrant yourself. Now after August came his successor, Cleomenes, and Cleomenes also saw that he would need to be in sole authority if he were to refound the laws of Lycurgus. So if we go on, the crucial sentence then is here. Cleomenes had all the ephors, all the office holders, and anyone else who might be able to stand against him killed, and then renewed altogether the laws of Lycurgus. So this is Republican violence. It's the paradox of force and violence being used to restore the laws, the order of the ancient republic. Now that will give Republicans with a small r and their contemporary Democratic heirs, again, Democrats with a small d, cold comfort because of the ambiguity of violence. We should be disturbed by this paradox. For it's often impossible to know in time whether someone is deploying violence as a would-be tyrant or as a Republican restorer. And even if they're trying to restore the republic, the use of violence violates the due process and civic protections on which a republic or a democracy otherwise depends, which it exists to defend. So violently interrupting the civic order in the name of saving it raises the question of whether the end can ever justify the means. Can freedom truly be saved or established by means of violence? Now, I'm going to leave Machiavelli on that paradoxical note. Here's how he leaves us himself in The Prince. He actually calls in the very last chapter of The Prince for a new prince who in the mid-16th century, the early 16th century, could unify Italy, which was divided into multiple different city-states and partly dominated by foreign powers. And if we see here the very end of The Prince, notice just in green, without trying to read all of the text, that he appeals again to Moses, Cyrus, and Theseus as models for the new prince who might use violence to resurrect the oppressed, divided people of the Italians of his day. So let me finally turn now to Friedrich Nietzsche to look at the paradox of persuasive force. So like his predecessors, both of whom he cites, Nietzsche, too, was fascinated by the transformative figure of Moses as a founder and lawgiver. And like Machiavelli and Rousseau, he also invoked Lycurgus and Solon. And like Rousseau, actually, he also talks about Muhammad. And he expands the pantheon of lawgivers still further in two directions. So to these other founders of ancient religions, Muhammad, Manu, the Hindu lawgiver, Zarathustra, the founder of Zoroastrianism, and also in ancient Greece, as we'll see, to include the philosophers, whom he thought had also sought to act as lawgivers. And it's in the case of the Greek philosophers especially that we find the paradox in Nietzsche's writings that I want to explore, which is that Nietzsche takes the ancient lawgivers to have drawn no sharp distinction between persuasion and force. So far we saw Rousseau speaking for persuasion, Machiavelli championing the occasional need for force, and now Nietzsche saying, perhaps there's no sharp distinction. Perhaps philosophy itself is a mode of spiritual force. We should think of it itself as having a kind of powerful effect. So let's start with how Nietzsche saw the role of custom in creating traditions, beliefs, and identities over time. So here he speaks of the concept of the morality of mores or customs, and this is in his work Dawn or Daybreak. So we can see that he talks about the morality of mores or customs and all these different practices, agriculture, war, marriage, religion, all belong in the domain of morality. And if we go on, everything was originally a matter of custom. And here's the key. Anyone who wanted to elevate himself above custom had to become a lawgiver and create customs. So this is the role for the lawgiver. Again, it's that fundamental transformation of people's customs, laws, practices, ways of life. Now, Nietzsche explains this further by referring to Manu as the ancient Hindu lawgiver. And if we go on, this is a long quotation, so I won't talk about all of it, but he's talking about the mode of lending authority to a truth that has emerged over time. And if we continue, he says here, how do you do that? Well, the lawgiver appeals to revelation, but again, sort of in the way that we saw Machiavelli be a bit cynical about, is it real revelation or is it simply an invocation of the gods? And going on, making that revelation into tradition. So that's the Janus face again. You invoke the new revelation, and then you try to stabilize it as tradition. And there's this powerful phrase at the end of this passage, the authority of the law is founded on the propositions God gave it, the ancestors lived it. So far, we've seen Nietzsche appealing to custom, persuasion, religion. So where did force and violence come in? Well, throughout Nietzsche's writings, we find scattered calls for a warrior ethos. And we find this, for example, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, when he says the prophet adjures his followers that they should seek their enemies and they should wage war, but they're waging war for the sake of their thoughts. So this is that blending between the spiritual and the material. This is the persuasive force of thoughts, which count as a kind of spiritual warfare. And Nietzsche explains this in relation to the ancient Greek philosophers and the Greeks generally, when he imagines them saying, this is in an earlier work, look, I too can do what my great rivals can. I can do it better than them. So this is a sort of outdoing of others, but outdoing them in potentially the realm of thought. But it's a warrior ethos, as it were, in the realm of thought. And Nietzsche goes on to argue that each of the ancient Greek philosophers was, in fact, a contentious, violent tyrant. That is the underlying truth of Greek philosophy in his view. Perhaps Solon was an exception, but Nietzsche is not even sure about that because he holds at the end of the quotation that to be a lawgiver is a more sublimated form of tyranny. So remember that for Rousseau, the lawgiver had to be the opposite of a tyrant. They were nothing to do with human dominion. But for Nietzsche, the philosopher is a lawgiver who's in a way seeking a kind of personal power and tyranny. So he illustrates this by referring to a number of the ancient philosophers and above all Plato. And we'll return to what he says about Plato. Here he says Plato had the desire to become the supreme philosophical giver of laws and founder of states, although he thinks he didn't quite fulfill that aspiration, that desire. There are ancient reports that Plato had been invited to become a political lawgiver, for example, by the city of Megalopolis, but he had refused. Nevertheless, if we go on, Nietzsche saw Plato's legislative mission as being at the center of his will. And he says Plato measures himself with Solon and Lycurgus. So again, if we're going to think about founders and lawgivers, we shouldn't think only about the people who actually gave laws to Sparta and Athens. We have to think above all of the philosophers who exercise this kind of spiritual tyranny. So again, Nietzsche comments that Plato had a thoroughgoing political purpose and that in founding the academy, he sought comrades who could with him one day found the new state. And so it's in this way that Nietzsche takes Plato and these other philosophers and all of these lawgivers to be models for his own writing. So this is the most remarkable passage, I think, in Nietzsche. It's also from Dawn or Daybreak. Those are the same translations of the same German word. And here we find him comparing Plato to Muhammad. So he says, Plato was trying to do in Sicily what Muhammad later did for the Arabs. Both of them were actually trying to determine customs and things great and small and to regulate everyone's day-to-day mode of life, just in that way that we saw before, games, festivities, customs, that could be done here through philosophy and through founding. And he goes on that Plato's ideas were as practical as those of Muhammad were practical. It was just a matter of chance that the world did not see the Platonization of the European South. So for Nietzsche then, all of these figures, Plato, Socrates, Lycurgus, but also Manu, Muhammad, Moses, and Zarathustra, all of them are models for what he himself is doing as a lawgiver. So these figures are all in some way spiritual and intellectual, but they're also material and political. And all of them then inform Nietzsche's own call repeatedly for what he calls the legislators of the future. So he's imagining possible future figures who might be able to convey laws in a way that could make them incarnate. And in a fragment from the period of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he remarked on people who are walking legislation. Remember Lycurgus wanting to write on the hearts of the Spartans. The idea here is that people have to come to incarnate these new values, and therefore that will make these values real as physical force could potentially make them. So perhaps it was his consciousness again of that tension that Janus faced between the revolutionary impulse and the conservative impulse in law-giving that made him want to appeal to these philosophers of the future. In a way, the creation of an educational politics was, I think, more important to him than any particular political movement. So to conclude, I've called politics a spectrum of the possibilities of power. And if that's so, then we always need to interrogate just where, in realizing those possibilities, the boundary between persuasion and force might lie. Now, in this lecture, I've explored the paradoxes that cluster around that boundary as a matter of political thought. Next week, in my final lecture in this series, I will address it in the history of several actual political revolutions. But for tonight, we may conclude with this remark of Nietzsche's about the purpose for which lawgivers must act and the imperatives that arise as a result. So Nietzsche remarked, "One must desire the means when one desires the end." This political insight was clear in the mind of all legislators. Thank you very much.